One of the best ways that you can support the podcast and your training is to join the crew. When you join the crew, you get an extra crew cast podcast every single month. You also get access to our Discord, which has a training Q&A with Team Elite FTS members. You get form checks. You can upload any of your training footage and have your lifts diagnosed, sometimes within minutes, by multiple people. Access to close to 30 different ebooks, training logs, and first sign up access to our weekend training retreats, train your ass off, and other events that we do. Biggest takeaways from that, though, what people enjoy the most and get the most out of is the training Q&A and the form checks, as well as the extra podcast. All right, guys, I'm back in the gym with another limited edition apparel drop. This is the new Live, Learn, Pass On shirt. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about our cambered grip American cable attachment. This attachment has 4 grips and it's cambered. So when you flip it, it actually becomes 8 grips. And if you turn it upside down, there's actually 16. This is one of our most used cable attachments out in the gym. Even got that full range of motion. We got a second limited edition drop this month as well. Head over to elitefts.com, pick up the shirt, pick up the cable attachments, and we'll see you next time. America Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told as part of getting older? You just go to americahealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done. And then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. americahealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk.
Today's episode is brought to you by EliteFTS.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Kassem Hanson, along with Tom Shepard, and we're going to be talking about all things hypertrophy, and we're going to try to earn the hypertrophy, right? Because that still makes me laugh when people say that, and it still happens in today's world, which blows my mind, but it does. So Kassem is the owner of N1 Education. It's an education platform that works with coaches and people that just have a strong interest in training, nutrition, and so forth, right? I'm kind of scanning the thing yesterday to get a better idea of kind of what the course is. Explain it a little bit more to me.
So like the N of one part of the brand, basically that's a play on like a, research terms of like, okay, this is an individualization. So we're looking at everything from biomechanics to program design, and basically how do we take the principles or the, maybe some of the templates and just take everything and make it a little bit more individualized. So like basically pulling more nuances. So we get coaches that want to learn a little bit deeper anatomy, or they want to learn a little bit of like, hey, how do I do exercise and technique manipulations, or how would I adjust my exercise selection or my programming variables to make this a little bit more unique to that individual structure, their goals, etc. Right? So it's just taking everything to an even more individualized level.
All right. How did you get there? So it's like, what's been the process to get to where you're at now? Because that's what you're known for. And I saw you present at Swiss, so we'll get into that a little bit. Tom's got questions too. But how did you get to the point where you're able to have that platform and that knowledge to be able to help other people?
I mean, a lot of it is just evolution over time. Like you start off learning things more generally, right? And so then you can only apply those things generally. My background is biochemistry at a university level. And then basically I spent probably 3 times as much as I did in university going and learning from just the best in the field that I could find, right? Like I was a seminar junkie, just like being here at Swiss was a great chance to just be around a bunch of, like-minded people. And as I evolved as a coach, basically what I found is that more and more of the decisions that I was making was starting to deviate from like my base knowledge of, physiology and stuff, and come down more to like this data I was getting from the specific person. Right. And so then I started pursuing like, well, let me look at maybe an anatomy in a little bit more nuanced level. Let me learn maybe a little bit more about what's going on in these exercises so that I can start making those decisions on an individual level. And for me as a coach, that really like increased like my just ability to get results with people. And then I was like, all right, this is probably for me like the most valuable thing that I've stumbled upon myself is like these little things that I'm finding. And so then I just started kind of passing that on with the people I was around. And, being somebody that was a seminar junkie, of course, you're networking and people are interested in what you're doing. And I was like, okay, I should probably start teaching this formally. And basically you just got to get your feet wet. And so I started like, hey, I'm just going to throw out a beta test version of this stuff and just throw it out to a bunch of people that I respect, and everybody just gave me tremendous feedback. And then I basically was like, all right, cool, let's start scaling this. And I started online mostly because that was just the lowest barrier of entry, right, for me to deliver this, even though I believe the best way to deliver this stuff, especially like biomechanics, it has to be in person. Like you have to see this stuff, but also do this stuff and be like, you have to, I don't want to say like just that you have to feel it, because there's limitations with, how much you can feel and perceive in an exercise, but you do have to be a part of that process, not just with yourself, but you got to see different bodies. You got to actually go through the troubleshooting, because not everybody walks into an exercise and you give them a cue and they think the same thing, right? You tell one person to push or pull one way or whatnot. And like, I tell people, like, I don't care if you like, whatever the cue is, you tell people think about purple elephants. If that's what it takes to change their technique, that's all that matters. And if you're just observing stuff on video, you're not going to pick up any of those elements. You're not going to go through that problem solving process. So started online because the barrier of entry was lower. So I focused a little bit more on program design. And then as soon as it became feasible, I was like, okay, cool. Now that I have enough attention that I could get people to travel and come and like invest in the time of doing this in person, that's where then the biomechanics stuff really started to blow up and take off. And I think the reason it became so popular is just because it's such an easy thing to like learn and then instantly start applying, and you can just apply it in so many places.
So you mentioned that over time you started to step away from preconceived ideas, templates, and more towards information you were gaining from the individual, right? So for you, what does that information gathering process look like for that client? So do you have a specific assessment protocol for individuals that you then maybe coach to those coaches at certifications? Or are we talking again more about maybe a nuanced ongoing process as you work with someone? Like, how does that work? How do you gather that information? What do you look for?
So there's definitely things that we can do in terms of assessment, but if I'm talking about the way that I apply it the most, it's more so really just being conscientious of what your clients are doing, what their feedback, and actually just tracking how well am I getting results relative to the goals that I'm trying to accomplish. So you might start with the mindset of an exercise does X or Y function. And then through working with clients, you realize like, okay, that works fine for Bob. For Steve doing the same exercise, that's not having the same effect. So why is that, right? Is it because when Steve does it, his arm path is different because he's got, longer arms or, a different shaped rib cage or whatever it is. And so like part of the assessment that you can do in real time is just simply looking at a person's structure, like looking at the unique anatomy of that person and saying, okay, based off of you, if you lay on the same bench angle, it's the equivalent of you doing a different bench angle than this other person. So for you, I would move it for 10 degrees, or, for you, it's like you have this much ankle mobility, or your femurs are this long. So for you to get like the same squat quality from a muscular perspective, I'm going to change your stance, or I'm going to put you on a heel wedge or whatnot to try and make sure that, I'm not choosing like, hey, these people have the same goal, so they're doing the same exercise. It's really these people have the same goal, so I need to make sure what's happening in that exercise is the same. And so what I'm really doing is I'm assessing what I can from a visual perspective, right, and applying what I know. But then I'm really paying attention to just, are we actually progressing in the areas that I want, right? So if somebody comes in for a specific strength or physique goal, it's one thing to make progress, but it's another thing is the progress specific to what I'm trying to do and at the rate of what I would expect? And I I'm like kind of a data nerd, and I'm always thinking like, how can I do this better? So I would just constantly be pulling apart what I was doing and be like, okay, well, I did this time and this time, and this worked a little bit better for this person. This worked a little bit better for that person. Why is that? Right. And then going through that troubleshooting process and implying like, okay, well, it would make sense for this person's, their shoulder range of motion. That's probably why they're able to get more out of this exercise than this person isn't. And then you just start picking up those tidbits. And you're like, okay, cool. There's definitely something here to individualizing this stuff. And what kind of pursued me to dig even more into the nuances of anatomy and biomechanics so that more of this stuff could be proactive than reactive. Right.
Absolutely.
And right. And I think that's what I try to do now is I just try to get people ahead of that game. So basically it's like, they don't have to do the years of just like troubleshooting, trial and error. They can start further ahead in terms of the foundational knowledge. And basically they can be guessing right earlier and then troubleshoot from there, like, way ahead of, when I started doing it.
Do you peel that back further when you're working with him? Says, I'm looking at this as like a needs analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Like if somebody was to come and help with a program design, there's a needs analysis that I'd kind of run through, like what is the sport, what are the sport demands, what are the energy systems involved, what's the injuries, is all that part of that? Or are you just focusing straight on here's the movements and the exercises are refined for that person?
So, excuse me. I would say like a lot of that stuff, I would say like there's some global and long-term outcomes that you're looking for, but the stuff that, that we focus more is like, it's a little bit more acute and a little bit like, you could look at it as like, okay, over the long haul, I need to have this adaptation for that person, right? But what we're trying to solve the problems is well, how do I get that adaptation for that specific person on the day, right? And so we're looking at a lot more like, okay, cool. We're trying to get there, but that's going to take consistency. That's going to take volume. That's going to take effort. We need all those things. But what I'm trying to do mostly with our base level of education in biomechanics is figure out, okay, how can we troubleshoot the exercises so that as you're applying that volume and effort and all the traditional programming variables that you would use, that you're getting a few more percentage points out of the exercise selection and the technique that you're using, and we're reducing that injury risk, right? And because when it comes to individualizing stuff, there's going to be things that everybody needs. Like everybody, there's no, you might argue that some people have had success without working hard, but on average, everybody's got to train hard. On average, everybody's going to have to do a certain amount of volume. They're going to need to do a certain amount, like those principles are going to carry on. And so there's some flexibility and some buffering ranges in those. But those are hard to change. Like acutely, like you see a guy, it's hard to know exactly how much volume they need. Mm-hmm. Right. Or exactly what type of intensity is going to be best for them. With the biomechanics stuff, that's stuff that you can acutely look at and start to be like, okay, cool. Like I can start optimizing this guy's exercise within minutes and get feedback that I know that we're making, a good choice. Right. And that's not to say that it's more important. It's just, I think it's something that we have a lot of control over. So like, why not take advantage of those areas to optimize their training?
Yeah. I maybe say something a bit controversial, but in my opinion, I'd say probably exercise selection. If you had to pick one variable that determines success of a training program more than any other variable, for me, it would be exercise selection. Because what I mean, and Dave, I'm sure you've seen this, like you can have guys who work incredibly hard consistently, they do all the other stuff right, but if their exercise selection is poor in that it's not hitting the weak points it needs to hit, if it's, say, like a strength lift that they're trying to improve, or they're determined to use an exercise that is a poor choice for their biomechanics, their lever lengths to achieve an end goal, like someone like me with like 62% leg length trying to grow their quads with a back squat, probably not a great choice, right? So I think going in with that like you do to make the exercise variations used better and more optimal from the get-go, in my opinion, is probably the best thing to chalk off first, because people have had success with all sorts of sets, reps, volumes, training programs, etc. But how many people have you seen banging their head against the wall trying to use exercises to achieve an end goal that it's just not there for? It's just not correct for.
So I am not a fan of the question, like, what's the most important variable? Because we'll put it this way. There's a threshold for everything. So no amount of bicep curls are going to grow your quads, right? So it's like, how bad does the exercise selection have to be before it becomes the most important thing, right? And you could look at the same thing, like, how low does effort have to be before you could be doing the perfect exercise and it still doesn't matter? So I think, like, my preferred way to look at it, like, if you're going to try and look at these things, is we use what's called the principle of thresholds. It's like, look, all of the things need to be above like they need to meet a certain level of competency before you care about maximizing anything, right? So it's probably good to choose good exercises before you decide to apply a bunch of volume, time, and effort to it, right? I mean, you're wasting your time if you're, choosing poor exercises that are yielding poor results. But I don't, even though exercise selection is something that I teach, I don't rank it as more important. I rank all of this stuff as like a multiplication equation, where if you put a goose egg in any of them, then the outcome is zero, right? Perfect exercises, if you train hard but you don't do enough volume, probably not going to get there, right? Do a ton of volume with absolutely crap exercises and no effort, probably not going to get there, right?
Well, there's the execution of the exercise too.
Execution, right? And you do all the effort stuff and you don't recover, same problem, right? So I look at this as like, this is a multiplication problem, and all of these things need to be good enough. And then we can choose for the person. Like, some people have access to different equipment. Some people just are going to develop skills easier, right? So like, we kind of try and look at, like, from an individual, where is the best ROI for them? Like, some people, cool, they can train as much as they want. Other people, like, look, I'm busy, I got a family, I got this or whatever. So there's only so much volume I can do. And I'm not like, even if more would be the optimal way, it's just not literally an option, right? If you're training people online, your limit, like, how hard can you push somebody? Like, you can't just be on a Zoom video with them, even if you're doing it that way, and just like screaming through the little FaceTime thing, like, get it, go, 5 more. And they're just like, oops, closed. Mm-hmm. So the way that I prefer to look at it is like, get everything to a certain degree of competency and then maximize what's going to be the easiest and highest ROI for that person, right? I teach exercise selection because I believe it's one of the things that, as a coach, like, making those decisions is something we have a tremendous amount of control over, right? Other things we don't have as much control over, right? It's a lot harder to, coach somebody's recovery. It's a lot harder to, like, it's coach effort, right? The more subjective the variable becomes, the less control we have over it. Doesn't mean it's not important. It's just, if we're talking about maximizing our abilities of a coach, we should definitely capitalize on the things that are most in our control.
You mentioned there briefly, like, the stress levels, they've got a family and whatever. So, like, then moving on, when you're assessing, say you've done the exercise selection, biomechanics, maybe part of the assessment then, and you're looking at their programming in a more general sense in terms of frequency, training volume, intensity. Do you have specific variables that you like to quiz them on to kind of set a baseline for that, to give you a better idea of what, obviously then you adjust it over time, but when you're trying to put that initial plan together, estimating how much volume, how much workload do I think this individual can plan, are there specific variables that you look at that you think are very important in that?
Yeah, when it comes down to getting to the nuances of those variables, not only do I look at those details, but you have to look at like how those variables impact each other. For example, if we look at the relationship between how much volume I'm going to give somebody and the exercises that I'm going to choose, certain exercises are going to have more of a fatigue component. Certain exercises are going to be, more stimulus. Some are going to cause more failure. And so there's an efficient, like a per set efficiency for some exercises. So that means like, okay, if they have a really good exercise, so if we're talking about hypertrophy, let's say like, okay, we're focusing on an exercise that gets them into a place where the muscle is stretched, and it's more challenging there. That's going to be more stimulating, but there's also going to be a fatigue cost. So I'm going to be able to program fewer sets of that. But if they don't have access to that exercise, but they do have the ability to do more volume, like just they have the time to do it, well, cool. I can take an exercise that doesn't have as much of a potent per set stimulus, and then I can solve that problem with either training a little bit closer to failure or using a little bit more set volume or some combination thereof, right? So as you get into it, it's not just like, well, how much does this person need? I kind of look at it as like they need a certain amount of stimulus, but these variables can kind of go up or down or change in order to get that same stimulus. I can have a better exercise and better set efficiency with that, so I don't have to do as many actual sets of that. Or I can have a slightly less good exercise, but I can make up for it with a little bit of effort and volume, right? And it's not about, well, is that perfect or is this? People just want to get to the result, right? But you also have to be aware of like, if I'm being a little less efficient, well, okay, well then how's that going to affect? Do I need to bring up their nutrition a little bit, right? Is that going to affect the frequency, or how often I'm going to periodize their program or whatnot? If I'm using exercises that maybe aren't as good for them from a stimulus perspective, or maybe from an orthopedic perspective, maybe we're not going to stay in that as long, right? Or we're not going to do it as frequently, or maybe there's going to be a few things that I'm going to add to their program to complement or make up for those things. So I'm looking at from a person's, like basically from their training history, to kind of get a baseline of like, what's the volume of stimulus that they're going to need to make that progress. But then I will manipulate those variables a little bit more nuanced based off of what options that I have in terms of how often they can train, how long can they train, what exercises do they have access to, how skilled are they, how hard do they actually work, right? You can write train to failure in a program, but if they don't actually train to failure, then you have to find a way to compensate for that program. Everybody's had a client that goes to one extreme on the spectrum. You tell them, leave like 3 reps in the tank, right? And they left their soul in the exercise. And I'm like, okay, that's not what we were going for this week. And then you have the other person, you tell them to take it to failure, and clearly they had like 4 more reps. So as a coach, you're like, okay, if I know that this person is not going to push as hard, cool. I'm going to, even though I know that like the program on paper meets the stimulus, knowing that individual, I'm going to add that other set. Or I'm going to be like, this should be 2 RIR, but I'm putting 0 because I know that when I put 0 on paper, it's 2 in reality, for that person. So I'm looking at making all those adjustments on top of like, yeah, cool. Based off of their previous history, they've been doing this much volume, right? They've been training this long, those type of thing. I can get it like, all right, yeah, this is about what they should be doing on average per set volume. But if the exercise quality goes up, maybe I can bring that set volume down. If it goes down, maybe I have to bring it up. And I just look at, of the tools that I have available, what's the best way to make sure I can get the stimulus for that person.
Let me throw this out as an example, and you can kind of build off of that. So we'll just stay with hypertrophy and the body part. We're just going to say triceps, and we're just going to assume normal bro who goes in the gym, fairly good technique. Mm-hmm. Okay. The close grip bench press to the push down. So obviously the close grip bench press, as you were talking about exercise selection and the changes over that, is going to be more fatiguing than what the push downs would be. So they'd be able to push the volume more so on the push downs versus the close grip bench press. Now this is just bro stuff. We're not playing tempo. We're not doing any other kind of shit because you can equal it, right? So I'm going to let you guys kind of go on that. But that I'm just trying to help the people who are listening to kind of see what you were talking about from the first part of that answer, because then it peeled deeper and deeper and deeper. But I don't think if they get the first part, they're not going to be able to get, what's deeper and deeper. So going back to that first part, use the close grip bench press and
tricep push down might not be something easier, like a machine type of push down that's going to isolate even more so they can't like use lats and shit like that. So something more isolated. So use like a close grip bench press with something more isolated to describe exactly what you were talking about. And then you can get into the rest, the nutrition and all that other stuff. So we're going to peel it super simple.
Yeah. So, if I'm comparing like, all right, I'm writing a program and I'm trying to choose how many sets, and option 1 is I have close grip bench press. Option 2 is I have an isolated elbow extension, machine of some type. The considerations for theirs is like, well, the isolated one is like, it's only tricep fatigue that's coming from that, right? So the systemic fatigue is much lower. So I might be able to actually get slightly more fatigue directly in the triceps, but overall, like my total volume for the day would not be as impacted as much because it's only one muscle. It's not a big muscle. So when I'm looking at that, I'm like, okay, cool. Like close grip bench press, I'm probably not going to be able to put as many sets in that because I'm adding more total systemic volume to their program. So if let's say that tricep hypertrophy was very important, like more important than pressing strength, more important than delts and whatever, then I'm going to lean way more towards using the more specific exercise, right? And I'm probably going to be able to do more sets of the tricep extension and maybe more variations of those type of exercises. So maybe instead of just having one machine, maybe I could do tricep extensions with 2 different grip orientations or something like that because I have those additional sets to work with, right? So I'm looking at, cool, anything I can do that allows me to have a little bit more volume, does that open up the option for maybe me to do something where I can play around with other training variables like, okay, I can use 2 exercises, or I can, change the tempos, or I can use some sort of intensifier like a drop set or, a rest pause. Like if I have a little bit more volume or I have a little bit more fatigue to work with, then I can start incorporating other things as well, not just simply looking at straight set to straight set option, right? So I really like finding those type of solutions when somebody has a very specific goal. But on the other side, let's say somebody had a limited amount of time and they cared about triceps, but they also cared about delts and other things. You can look at it as like, well, I'm stimulating more things with the close grip bench press. So if the goal for that person isn't so biased towards tricep hypertrophy and more so I'm trying to get hypertrophy in more areas in an overall small time or smaller number of sets, then those exercises where they may not be as ideal or optimal if we're looking at an individual muscle, but they accomplish more on a per set basis, those then become actually the better solutions, right? So when you're looking at what you have to work with, if you're very limited, you tend to need to do exercises that do more things. But if you're not, you tend to get more out of exercises that can be very specific, because when you do very specific exercises, you know for sure that the thing that you're going for is the thing that's going to cause failure in that exercise, right? But, you know, if I'm doing a bunch of pressing work and stuff like that, and then I go to do my close grip bench, maybe the fatigue in my chest or my delts is going to limit actually how much tricep I can do that. Or maybe I'm going to reach the point where it's like these sets are no longer productive, but man, I still have, you know, something left in the tank for, you know, triceps. And there's plenty of scenarios where you could use both. Like if you have 6 sets to work with, it doesn't have to be one or the other. You know, it could be anything from like, hey, 5 sets of close grip bench and then just go do one, just all out, you know, drop set, myo rep, whatever your favorite intensity method or whatever it is on the tricep extension. So it's like, okay, cool. And then you could do everything else to the opposite extreme of that as well, right? So I really like people to not pigeonhole themselves into one thing, but understand what are the pros and cons in each, and understand that there's a gray area to work with in there as well.
I like that you touched on that in your talk at the Swiss, because, you know, I think obviously that the industry goes through trends all the time and everything always comes back around and stuff like that. And optimal exercise selection is kind of like a bit in vogue right now, but like things always get taken too far, natural human nature, right? But like, I think a lot of the times people then forget that, yes, there's optimal exercises for every muscle group. If we're after pure hypertrophy and development, yeah, most of those are going to be isolation movements and certain ones are going to be better than others. But 90+% of the people you work with only have so much training money that we can invest, right? And not everyone has the ability to do 3 or 4 isolation movements, or say like 10 to 12 sets per muscle group individually on a weekly basis. You know, they've got busy jobs, they've got lifestyles, and that's where even if your goal is pure hypertrophy, that's where the compound movements can come in by just giving us not optimal singular muscle stimulus, but good muscle stimulus for variable muscle groups, probably in less time, less investment. Yes, the neurological cost is higher, more joints moving, more stabilization, but I think sometimes people lose grasp of that kind of bigger concept where, what's optimal on like a micro individual muscular scale is not necessarily what's always going to be optimal on a macro scale for that client. So if you're dealing with someone that has limited training time, maybe it's 3 days a week, or they have low recoverable volume for whatever reason, how do you go about determining what muscle groups, what exercises we primarily maybe are happy to just stimulate with compound movements, and then which muscle groups and movement patterns maybe we need to focus more on with isolation movements? Does that make sense? Do you have like a thought process there in particular?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's going to start with, well, what do we have access to in general? Fortunately, most compound exercises are fairly accessible, right? It's not like you have to have a specialty gym to do a squat, right? But if we take that, it's like, well, okay, but if they're not built for a squat, like you could be like, well, do we have the ability to elevate the heels? Do they have some sort of specialty bar that we can take advantage of, et cetera, right? Do we have, some sort of good squat or leg press machine? So I'm looking at like, okay, what are the options that I have to work with? And then I'm trying to figure out, it's like, so what is our goal? Is our goal complete balance? And so let's say that somebody I want symmetrical hypertrophy across my whole body, right? What I would do is I would look at, okay, what are the best like bang for your buck in terms of exercises that kind of stimulate the most things, but they're not going to stimulate everything evenly. So like just because an exercise is good for multiple body parts doesn't mean those multiple body parts all get the same size piece of the pie. So what I'm going to do is like with whatever volume I have left after I would utilize those, is then I'm going to supplement with more specialized exercises for the parts that aren't getting as much stimulus, for the things that got the smaller piece of the pie from the compound exercise. So if somebody is a very hip dominant squatter, then maybe I'm going to add some leg extensions in as the volume over extra posterior chain work. But if it was the opposite, then I would flip that, right? If somebody isn't, a arm dominant presser, then maybe I'm going to add in some direct chest work, right? But if it's the opposite, then maybe I'm going to add. Now, a lot of that also sometimes is sorted out because oftentimes people are like, yeah, I want general hypertrophy, but I want to focus on XYZ a little bit more. And so sometimes that makes those decisions even a little bit easier without having to look at the exercise. You're just like, okay, you on general just want to be bigger, but you kind of want your side delts to really pop on your next vacation, right? Or you really want, to grow that, thick booty type thing. Like, okay, cool. Yeah. Well, then then it's like, cool. We're going to cover like essentially like the minimum that we need across with the compound exercises. And then whatever isolation work we have, we're going to dedicate to that thing that's just like super important. And then that's not just like, I would say, good for the results perspective. People love feeling like they're actually getting what they want out of the training. So like there's a psychological component of like, hey, if I really want to work this body part, if I'm doing a bunch of compound things and it does, like, I can't really tell or feel that I'm kind of targeting that thing that I want. Also having some element of your program so that, you leave the day thinking like, yeah, I do have, a good pump, or I did really stress or stimulate that area that's important to me. I think there's a psychological component to that also helps reinforce the effort and the consistency, and stuff as well. So because of that, I may sometimes, even if I need to, steal a little bit more volume from the compound things to give it to that very specific thing, because I think it's just going to make their overall adherence and enjoyment of the program better as well.
Another way to look at it is if it's a time demand and it's hypertrophy only, I got to make some of these stupid decisions with my own training. Like, and it's a leg day. Like, how long is it going to take me to actually warm up to squat when I'm going to need to squat for 2 sets of 6 or 8 or whatever it's going to be? That's way longer than it's going to take me to actually do the leg presses, do leg curls, do leg extension, and be the fuck out. So it's what you have access to. I think strength can be a parameter with that as well, because how long is it going to take to actually do the sets that you need to do? Overhead press could be an example there. It could take somebody, if they get a good overhead press, long, to warm up to that. If delts are, so we're just talking delts and triceps, they can knock out 3 or 4 things on a machine in that same period of time. And hypertrophy wise, give maybe better stimulus. I mean, it's debatable. It's debatable. But knowing what the energy cost, I think what we're saying here is knowing what the energy cost is of what that is. And then looking at it throughout not just the whole day, but how that training session will impact the next training session and then the next training session and then what happened before. And then you could start looking at outside factors like you were talking about earlier. Are these being impacted because of sleep, nutrition, all those other things? One thing, hypertrophy or strength related, that I completely see is people aren't thinking about how this session is going to impact the next one. And if you do something really stupid or a challenge set or something like that on this one, it's like you have to make a decision. Is this worth, fun or whatever you're doing it for, is this worth having to compromise and change what's going to be next? Right? Or you just start draining the tank. So
when you're looking at time and when you're looking at fatigue across things, there's so many ways that you can, or there's so many solutions to find. I think that's what the exciting thing about coaching is. And I think that's where, ultimately I think coaching is problem solving. That's what it is at its most basic element, right? So if you have somebody that's going from training 3 times a week to 4 times a week, cool. Like maybe, and now if we're training legs twice in the same week, I'm going to approach that totally different, right? Versus having 7 days to recover. Like, okay, maybe now I'm going to, instead of having an exercise that does everything, one day is going to be a little bit more quad dominant and the other day is going to be a little bit more posterior chain dominant, so that there's just less fatigue, crossing over, right? If we're looking at, from a time efficiency standpoint, we have multiple ways to do compound exercises. We can look at, all right, based off of somebody's strength and skill, what takes the least amount of time to get into the point where we're actually working. You can look at solving that with rep ranges, right? You don't need as much warm up to, prepare for a hard high rep set as you do for a hard low rep set. So you can start finding places in each one of these programming variables to solve the problem, right? It's like, cool, we can do this, right? Or, we can do a superset, or, hey, can I pre-exhaust, a muscle group so that, this thing, I don't have to warm up as much because I'm just not going to use as much total loading that day. When we're talking about hypertrophy, you have a lot more flexibility because you don't have to reach the same intensities that you would, for strength. So, usually when it comes to like the different goals, you have the most options when it comes to hypertrophy. Like you have the most flexibility between the variables and still get to the destination for somebody.
I'd be keen to just get your general thoughts on training frequency for muscle groups, because a lot of all the research is coming out now is, basically if you equate volume, doesn't matter, right? But is it ever really that simple? What I mean is, say you've got a guy who's a high level bodybuilder, right? His trainability is low, his training volume is high because it has to be, right? Maybe that guy needs 30 sets a week for legs, so just to throw a number out there, right? Maybe he could get the same hypertrophy stimulus if he did it all on one day, on Monday, whatever. But is the quality of the work going to be good throughout that entire session? What's the recovery process like from that 30 set workout compared to maybe a 15 set workout on Monday, 15 set workout on Thursday, just as random examples there. So what do you see and what do you like to do in terms of your approach to training frequency? Is it very much that you think it doesn't matter too much, or does it change based on their volume and so on and so forth?
Yeah. So I think an important caveat for anybody that's like trying to translate the research to what we do is always remember that the research is usually only answering a very limited question. Oftentimes we don't get the principle that we get is very limited in that they tested 2 conditions and all we really know is that one was better than the other. We don't know anything about everything in between and every other possible variation. We get enough research and we can maybe see a trend leaning towards one thing or another, but we still may not know exactly where the cutoff point is for something. So when it's looking at frequency and just volume equating it, it seems to be that the most important thing is that we get enough of the work in. right? Like hypertrophy training really comes down to how much work do you do over time, times the quality of it. Like that's the equation. So can we do more in a single session? Sure. Can we, do less in a single session and do it more frequently? Sure. But there's going to be a point of diminishing returns in both of those. And I think that the things that you have to look at for an individual athlete is like based off of the way that you're training, the exercises that you're choosing, what is that point of diminishing returns within a session? But there's also going to be kind of like a minimal amount that you need in a session. Like, for example, you were saying like, hey, if you were going to do heavy squats, it's going to take you more warm-ups, right? So not only is that more time, right? But we'll also have to consider like, okay, well, that's going to come with a certain fatigue and whatever, right? So it's like, all right, well, if I'm choosing that exercise and that rep range, that's going to come with a certain amount of costs, right? And you probably want to get an ROI on that, right? So if you're going to spend a lot of time, prepping and getting ready and doing something, you don't want to do just like a really small amount of volume. And I'm like, cool, now I'm going to do all of that crap again, just to do like, one set again, like, like that's extremely inefficient. So I'm looking at like, what is that space where we need to do over a certain threshold of volume within a session for it to be productive. And that's going to be dependent on the exercise selection and also making sure that I'm actually being efficient with my time. Like whatever it takes for me to prep and actually get work out of that I'm actually getting enough work to justify the time and effort to get there. And then what is the cap on that? And how many other exercises or whatever could I layer on that same muscle group? And that's going to vary not just on the individual, but it's going to vary a lot on the types of muscles. So, if we're talking about like the quads, we have knee extension. It's not a super complicated joint. It pretty much moves in one direction. You look at the shoulder, that's totally different, right? It moves all over the place. The pecs is a fan muscle. So some of them are going to pull up and across. Some of them are going to pull down. So my ability to do chest exercises that are very different in the tissue that they're targeting is much easier than it is for my quads, right? Like, we can bias the quads a little bit. We can change the length of the rec fem with the hip position or whatnot, but we're still training knee extension and all the, like, proportionately, all the quads are working more in every exercise relative to all the pecs are working. We just have the ability to segregate some muscles more than others. So that means
I'm wasting my time doing 3 sets, toes in, 3 sets here, 3 sets here, 3 sets there.
Yeah, you might, right? That might be just a hair too redundant, right? So if I'm looking at doing a bunch of variation of chest exercises, well, I could either fit more variations in the same workout, and that would be more productive because it would just be the same thing over and over again. But I could also look at that as like, cool, on one day I can hit certain divisions, and then I would be able to train that muscle group sooner if I did different divisions. So if I train upper chest on Monday, that fatigue's not like going to dissipate like relatively fast when I'm looking at, well, how much lower chest fatigue was there on upper chest day? So then if I train lower chest, I can have that day closer versus if I'm doing a simple joint where, everything's going to be getting the same amount of stimulus. I might want a little bit more time in there, or I'm going to have to compensate by the individual days or lower volume. Yeah. Right. So that there's just not as much fatigue to bring over. Right. So try and find what that window is and then look at what you have and understand that, like, okay, the more different I can make the exercises, either the more volume I can tolerate in a session, or the more I can mash those 2 sessions closer together if I'm targeting different tissues, because there's just less fatigue carryover. So less fatigue carryover allows me to either like have more of both. Right. Yeah. But when you look at something simple, that also just means that you're probably going to need fewer sets and fewer exercise variations overall, because just the exercises are more similar.
Yeah. Well, now we'll throw in something that's more complex. So your back.
Okay.
Like, so the back day, so now you're dealing with a whole lot of things, as far as muscle groups, movement patterns, and all those.
Yeah. Well, the first thing you have to understand is what the F does back mean, right? Because we don't have front day.
Yep.
To me, that's always funny. It's like nobody trains front day, right? But that would be the equivalent, right? If you're like, okay, your erectors are actually your abs, right? Imagine that, like, we do seated cable rows. Imagine that people did some sort of like, seated cable bench press thing where they're just having to like work their abs the whole time. So if you kind of like, I do think that's actually a helpful context for people to look at, because if you consider it that way, you'd be like, oh man, like how limited would your chest training be if you weren't ever using a bench? right? And so, okay, if we're talking about the back, like, man, your abs would be absolutely shot, right? Before you got all of your test and tricep and whatever. Like you'd be trying to do tricep press downs and you'd be like, oh, my freaking abs. Like I can't even lean over into the thing. So when we're looking at the back, we have to kind of figure out like, okay, what do we mean by, are we talking about lats? Are we talking about traps and rhomboids? You know, I include, like, when I say upper back, I basically am like, all right, it's rear delt, it's teres major, it's traps, rhomboid, basically everything north of the lats. And then I look at lats as kind of like the separate thing. And then I look at, okay, then all of my spinal erectors and, you know, my posterior obliques, QL, all of those things. Right. So that's kind of like how I divide it up. That doesn't mean that's the right way, but that's kind of what I look at, because
it's pretty much how everybody I know looks at it.
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of smart people.
Yeah. You got a good point.
Yeah. But I mean, some people do look at back as like, okay, it's just back. So when they do a row, they try and get spinal flexion, extension, and as well as all of the protraction, retraction. Like they're trying to hit all of the motions in one thing, right? Which if you were legit trying to play, or, you know, the game where it's like I'm hitting back, or sometimes jokingly we use the term called knack, which is neck to ass crack, right? Just so that it's specific. Knack. Yep. I'm trading knack, just neck to ass crack, like everything.
I'm going to steal it. I'm going to
knack day. So I break it up into those. So then I can look at, because you're going to have lower body stuff that's going to, you know, load the erectors, the posterior obliques, like all of that stuff. But, you know, you're going to have a lower fatigue cost in some of the upper back stuff, but it's not nothing, right? Like, I mean, if you're doing squats, your rhomboids and your traps and your lats aren't really, you know, doing much. They're not doing nothing, but they're not doing enough that you need to consider the fatigue. But for sure, your erectors are. But if you're doing pulls, well, yeah, cool. Then now my traps and my rhomboids and stuff are actually being loaded. And for some people, I mean, that may be literally the majority of the stimulus that they need in those motions, and they may not need to do much, or they may not need to do any more load or any more work in the stretch position, because their heavy pulls are doing that. And so basically all of their isolation work should be at the opposite range of motion. So not just from a hypertrophy standpoint, but just from an orthopedic and shoulder health standpoint, because they're cool. You load your traps in their stretch, but do you ever load them when they're, you know, fully shortened? So, you know, based off of what I'm going to do for my posterior or in lower body, I know I have that fatigue cost to accommodate. And then I'll try and, you know, figure out, all right, how does that affect what I'm going to choose, you know, in terms of my lat training or whatnot. So if I do a heavy RDL or deadlift on one day, I'm probably not going to want to come in and do a bent row, or really any sort of row where I don't have a chest support very soon. Right. Or even vice versa. Right. Like I wouldn't want to do heavy bent rows and then come in and, you know, set the like world's worst record for RDLs the following day, and my hamstrings got no stimulus because just my erectors failed. So it's looking at, okay, what's the fatigue crossover? And you will have more, like, in terms of posterior chain, you're not going to have a lot of options where you're not going to also load the erectors. But in terms of rows, we have tons of machine options, right? There's tons of options to do chest supported rows. We can do single arm rows, and that will decrease it a little bit, you know, and things like that. So I'm going to try and get solutions where they're the easiest to find. So that's kind of like what I'm going to look at there. It's like, all right, if I'm training back, what do I need to fill in that isn't getting stressed from maybe the, you know, indirectly from those compound things? And so maybe I add some complementary ranges of motion, et cetera. And how do I find support and stability so that I can train the areas that I want without being limited by areas that either I don't want to fatigue for tomorrow's or the upcoming session, or are already fatigued from the previous sessions.
Well, what you just answered, if strength athletes are paying attention, is because what's the big question is, where do I put back work? Right. Well, it goes in all the other days based upon what's not fatigued from what you did before. You know, so some days I call it elbows out positions and elbows in positions. So upper back, lat. It may not all be in the same day. Most likely it's not. You know, you got to look at the things that you were talking about there. And then sometimes things like a bent over row is like, oh, you know, that's a complex issue right there. Because if you're going to train that, then it's going to become now that thing that pulls a lot of the recovery demand. So it needs to be, if it's a strength athlete, we feel the same way. It needs to be for a very specific defined strength purpose. Which it oftentimes it is and should be, but then that really doesn't really become an exercise for that hypertrophy reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a strength reason, but there's still deficits, I think, in that hypertrophy range that has to be hit later with some of the things that you're talking about there.
Yeah. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So it's like
a lot of people think they can. Well, if you're 19, you probably can.
And one thing I'll add that's probably important is that sometimes the best solution is to double up on a day, even though it's far away from what we'd consider optimal. So say you have a heavy pull day, and you just know that there's not going to be a point within this program where you're going to have enough recovery that, cool, I could train upper back fresh and then I could pull fresh again. Well, screw it then. Put the upper back work on top of that. You know, you're going to be doing it in a state of fatigue, but I mean, to me, that's the most efficient place, because at least you're going to need less volume of it because you do have that fatigue in there. So cool, just do that, you know, and if upper back is a priority, then you just need to, you know, you need to reevaluate the whole structure of your program. But if you don't have the ability to actually get the recovery you need to actually like, okay, cool, now I can train this fresh and it's not going to interfere, then sometimes it's like, well, if I can't train it that way, then I might as well just like get the most out of it in the most efficient way possible, which is just put it when I is fatigued and just get whatever I can out of it there. Because obviously that's going to be a low priority relative to the posterior chain, like the reason that I'm doing the pull in that instance. When those goals flip, well then cool, then maybe either I have to change the pull or it's got to go or the volume's got to go down. So then all of a sudden those circumstances change.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you heavily there. Like I get a lot of questions if like say pendlay row and deadlift or block pull or something might end up in the same day, but it's a case of, well, you're better off doing them both now, because by the time you take your squat workout and, you know, for some people, even your bench workout, if they get a lot of lumbar fatigue from their arching, by the time you take those workouts into account as well, when are you going to be in a position where you can pendlay row efficiently, for example, you know, like, whereas you mentioned the time investment with warming up and all that type of thing, if those heavy rows are coming maybe before or after the hinge work or the block pull work, whatever it might be, the warm-up time has just come straight down because it's similar movement patterns and stuff like that, and it just ends up being more efficient for them. And then, you know, if their weak point is their upper back, then when that comes out and then they start deadlifting without the pre-fatigue from the pendlay row, what do we think happens after that point? You mentioned there about training, especially training back in the stretch position. Obviously, that came up a lot in your talk at the Swiss about how it's important to load muscles in the stretch position, but not all movements are the most difficult in the stretch position. So I've got kind of multifactorial question for you. I'm sorry. First off, again, a lot of research right now is looking at kind of stretch-induced hypertrophy, how we haven't seen it in every muscle group yet. You know, so my question to you is, do you think it's just a case of we haven't found a way to prove it exists yet in every muscle group? So like maybe the research is just lacking, or do you think it's something that could indeed be muscle specific? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if the body of research we have right now, we don't have evidence for every muscle, but of everything that's tested, basically we're favoring long muscle lengths.
Yeah.
So it's getting pretty close to the point where it would be very weird if all of a sudden we found a muscle that deviated from that, right? So because, I mean, we have quads, we have hamstrings, we have glutes, calves, sartorius, you know, like we're seeing this across things, the elbow flexors and extensors. So you could argue that like pecs and lats are hard to test in research, right? The lat is the skinny, like paper thin, you know, muscle, and it moves under the skin and whatnot. So it's hard to measure on ultrasound. It's hard to measure on EMG, you know, so a lot of what we're going to get in research is not necessarily the answers to the questions that we always want to know. It's going to be the questions that are feasible to answer, unfortunately. But we do have like a tremendous trend that lengthen bias training. And that's the way I prefer it, because stretch mediated is kind of somewhat of an undefined term and probably deserves to be, we'll say, relegated to actually doing loaded stretching or stretching, because the research on training at long muscle lengths is not always at the full stretch, right? It's just we're comparing a shorter to a longer muscle length, but it doesn't always have to be the terminal muscle length. So for example, the study on the quads, you know, in a leg extension, you can't get full knee flexion because there's just a thing in the way, right? I have an idea for one that's going to be extremely uncomfortable to do that, and I'll probably be the only one willing to use it. But, for the reality of it, you're not going to get full knee flexion in a leg extension. So it's trending towards showing that there's a benefit to being in a longer muscle length, even though it's not at the longest muscle length. And I think that's where we would look at the stretch mediated stuff, is the stuff that's actually looking at loaded stretching. So I tend to qualify this stuff as like we're training at longer muscle lengths or lengthen bias training, because the trend that we see is it's good if we're at a longer muscle length, if it's also challenging there. Right. Yeah. And I think that's where, when we look at what we have, we can really see like the bicep study is a great example of that, of the incline curl is a longer muscle length than a preacher curl. But at the incline curl, it's very easy at the bottom. Like you're basically doing nothing for the first 30 degrees. There also is the stability difference in those, right? So, in my lecture, I try to cover multiple principles. I spend a little bit more time on the length and bias thing because it's hot right now. But I would just throw out the caveat is that doesn't mean that other things aren't important, like specificity and stability, all of these things. But I think probably the question you're getting at is just okay, is that all muscles? Right now, I think that's a safe bet. Okay, there's nothing contradicting it. We don't have any instance where a short position partial shows a better thing, especially if we layer on the context of it also has to be challenging and specific enough, right? So the squat versus hip thrust study, that was a popular one. And so the squat and the hip thrust had basically equal stimulus or equal hypertrophy outcome, I guess, for the glutes. And you can look at that and you could be like, oh, okay, it didn't matter there. But if you take an honest look at it, you're like, well, okay, how many, if you guys have done a squat, how many of you guys would say hey, when I finished the squat, I took my glutes to absolute failure? Never, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even a hingy squat, it's going to be your back or your adductors or
air.
Yeah, air. So if we're being honest, if you're doing a hip thrust and you go to failure, you hit failure in your glutes, right? You stopped the exercise because your glutes couldn't do it anymore. So in that squat, we're comparing essentially maybe, if I'm just being generous, a 6 RIR physiological state for the glutes, right? If we were able to put bionic muscles in all the rest of your body, you probably could have done 6 more reps before your glutes were actually at the equivalent level of fatigue. So in that instance, we're looking at, a very specific but short muscle length exercise was equivalent to a lengthened exercise with maybe 6 reps in the tank versus the other one to failure. So if you layer that context on there, even there, it's okay, well, the short exercise didn't perform better. And under those conditions, we'd say it should have, if these things were the same, it should have blew the squat out of the water, right? But it didn't, even though the squat had all of the disadvantage. These were beginner lifters, right? So what do you think is going to be harder to teach to a beginner? A squat or a hip thrust, right? What's harder to train honestly to failure? A squat or a hip thrust, right? So no matter where you look at it, you could look at this as okay, the squat had every disadvantage towards hypertrophy in the population, the study design, etc. The outcome was similar. And so I look at that as look, if you want to be generous, you could be yeah, all right, in this instance, they were the same. But if we're accounting for the other variables in there, we'd be okay, this actually probably supports long muscle lengths if we take that stuff into consideration. And then unpublished yet, there is a study using a multi-hip machine and doing hip extension. And it found that doing a lengthened partial is better than doing the full range of motion for glutes. So if we look at the muscle in a more direct way, we are seeing that's that way for the glutes.
Is that with equal volume?
Yes. Yep.
Because that can always be a question that comes up, right? If we look at full range of motion versus partial range of motion, but volume is equal, is it equal if the mechanical work is half?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? If they're only doing half the range of motion, technically they need to do double the volume to get the same mechanical work. Well, I'm not saying that's efficient but it's not always a fair comparison, right?
So this is an interesting discussion right now, both in interpreting the research and in study design of what is equal volume, right? If is it volume load? Is it the same number of sets to the same degree of failure, et cetera? So I think the most like the most comparable thing is the same number of sets to the same degree of failure, right? Rather than volume load. Because anything that changes leverages, range of motion, or whatever, right? Okay, cool. That's going to change load on the bar. But I think that if we're looking at what's the physiological reaction to these conditions, it's set at a given effort, right? And we just call that 1 unit, right? Now, when we're
the effort still becomes hard to control.
It is, right? Yeah.
Because I mean, somebody can be psyched up and somebody not.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The same person from one week to the next.
Yep. So you're never going to have anything, I don't think, that's perfect. And I think it's actually valuable for us to have studies that have done this, like equalizing volume in multiple ways. Because you could argue that, you can do way more sets of hip thrusts in a week than you can squats because of the fatigue. So if we compared it, if we use like volume as like how much, like what is your tolerant level of volume? You would compare a lot more sets of hip thrusts to squats, right?
Yeah.
So like it's having volume load, that's valuable. Having set equated with effort, that's variable. And something that hasn't really been done would be like, okay, can we figure out what a tolerable number of sets is of these two exercises? Like find some way to figure out like, well, where's a certain fatigue drop, and then we just use that much volume and then comparing that, because I mean, if we're talking about like practicality in terms of
that makes more sense
right?
to me. Yeah.
That makes a lot like, so all of those pieces of information are valuable and we just don't have those yet. And that's where you kind of got to do the fuck around and find out thing on some of this stuff, but you don't have to do it blindly. That's where, okay, we know if you train the short positions, it's less fatiguing than length. And so, yeah, you're probably going to be, able to do a few more sets of those, but we also know they're a little less stimulating. So, a question is like, all right, are we really not like, we're seeing this and it's just, hey, this is just a per set efficiency thing that we're seeing, right? You could make the argument that one of the reasons that length and bias training is superior is simply because we get weaker in fatigue in the short position for a muscle, right? That we just fail there first. Even oftentimes if the exercise is fairly length and bias, right? So like, even if you're like, we would all consider a dumbbell chest press as hard at the bottom and easy at the top, right? Mm-hmm. Do you ever just do it and then on the rep that you fail, you go all the way down and you get nothing? No, you get some amount of a partial, right? And the higher the rep range, the more you get part of a rep and then another part and another part. Like you have to go to a blistering level of failure before you would literally get pinned to your chest or be working at a very, very low rep range, right? So if we look at this as like, well, any exercise that's more challenging in that short position is just simply going to end earlier. Right? The set is just simply going to end earlier. So one of the possible factors for length and bias training is it's literally just manipulating the volume that we're able to accomplish in a given set, right? There's theories on maybe, there's a little bit more localized mechanical tension in the lengthened position. That's another possible option. We don't know exactly how this works, and there's a number of possibilities. So there's still so much to find out. But if we look at the applied data on a per set basis, you're probably definitely safe for hypertrophy being like, hey, if I have an exercise that is more length and biased, I probably want to use that if it's equally as good across the other variables. But if you have another exercise that isn't as good, but maybe it's really stable, right? Or maybe it's a little bit more specific to the muscle group, then you could be like, well, maybe I can do that one, but maybe I'll train a little closer to failure, or I'll do a little bit more volume, or maybe I will split my volume across both of those. So I'm essentially getting some of the important principles in one exercise and complementing them with the other exercise.
So what I would wonder is if it's the lengthened position, so basically you have a greater range of motion, right? So you're going to have a little bit more time under tension. So it could be that as well, right? Is it the actual extra range of motion that's creating the effect? Because if that is the case, then things like 1 1/4, or doing partials after the end of the set would have more benefit if that's what it is. Or in other words, have they compared a slower tempo on just say that normal range compared to the normal tempo on the longer range to exclude what could be the actual just time under tension?
So the best way to describe what the research is on the length effect is it's the average muscle length of the set. And so they did a study on calves where basically what they did is they trained a full range of motion, and then they trained basically a middle range of motion so that the average muscle length would be the same and the results were similar. But if we do the length in half compared to the full range of motion, then the length in half is better for hypertrophy. So it's not that it has to be more of a stretch. It's just that on average, we're working at a longer muscle length over the course of the time.
Okay. Yeah.
So then if we're adding a quarter, basically that means that we're increasing the average length of that set because we're spending an extra quarter amount of time at a longer muscle.
So it could be at the bottom
length
or the top, and it's going to still be increasing that length of time.
No, the quarter would always be in the lengthened position.
Yes.
Right. So that the average time would be spent at a longer length.
Got
If
it.
that makes sense.
So I guess then the question then becomes totally the opposite to that then. In your opinion, in your programming, what role does emphasizing the shortened or the peak position play in hypertrophy, in your opinion? Is it a tool that's used because it brings across less mechanical damage, it's easier to recover from? Maybe it includes a greater accumulation of lactate growth factors. I don't know whether you believe that's important or not. What role does that play in training? Do you purposely program exercises that emphasize those positions? And if so, how much volume do they make up? How does that change, etc.?
So there's a multitude of reasons that I don't just throw everything out except the most lengthened things, right? One is orthopedically, I think there's still value to training a full range of motion, like just having the nervous system work there. And also strength is somewhat range of motion, positional, and contextual force vector specific. So if strength is part of what you're going for, or your goal is like, hey, I'm going to go for hypertrophy, but I don't want to then one day have to push something in the short position and I'm like, oh, I'm so not strong anymore, right? Okay, yeah, cool, I'm going to go train with my friend and I can do 405 at the bottom, but I can't lock out 225, right? I mean, obviously that's an exaggeration, but if I have even in my own training seen that okay, I've gone down and to like a machine or a regular press, and then all of a sudden yeah, the lockout is harder at this load than it used to be, even though I'm relatively stronger in the lengthened position. That you do see okay, the strength is a little bit different. And I have all like the prime equipment where you can change where it's hard and stuff. So I can be oh, and I'll just all right, I'm going to spend a week and I'm going to switch to the other setting. I'm oh, okay, this is I can tell that I am deacclimated to that, right? So there's an orthopedic benefit. There's a strength component throughout that, but you don't necessarily have to do the same volume. So I kind of look at it as I'm probably in a hypertrophy phase. I say I'm going to be somewhere around 70% focusing on the lengthened and about 30% on the shortened. And then a lot of times on body composition training and stuff like that, I might flip that, because if we're using shorter position exercises, we're not going to get as much of the inflammatory based, fatigue, right? Now, okay, maybe there's a little bit less muscle damage. Maybe there's a little less systemic fatigue. I can tolerate more sets. I can train more frequently. And if we're focusing on body comp, being able to do more training, right, tends to be good, because again, that's one of the things that's under our control as coaches. So, I mean, it's not a good idea to try and train for all of your calories to get lean, but by all means, if we can figure out for a way to accomplish more things. And a lot of times in the population that's focusing on body comp, they also have a whole bunch of postural issues and things like that. So being able to have volume to dedicate to those quality of life things is also fairly valuable. And yes, there is the metabolic component, where if we're doing what I would call a metabolic phases, where it's we're actually focusing on metabolite training, the adaptations that come from that, then working on that short position is a way of being able to get a stronger stimulus in that and not actually be as fatigued. So, having equipment where I can change these things drastically, the ability for me to come back and train my quads again, if I do leg extensions with that, the hardest part at the peak contraction, man, I can almost come back in the next day and I could still train quads, or for sure 48 hours later, right? If I do pendulum squats, or I put that leg extension loaded in the leg extend or lengthened position, and I'm leaning back and doing all the things to emphasize the lengthened position, if I come in 24 or 48 hours, my performance is going to it's going to be abysmal compared to what it would be under full recovery. So like there's very different options in terms of volume and training frequency across those. And sometimes, for what we're trying to accomplish, we want more of one of those or the other. Yeah. And if you're working with a new person, especially like if you're a coach that trains Gen Pop, or you're exposing somebody to a new exercise, is your goal like, hey, they're not going to walk this week, right? Like that may not be the experience that you want to give somebody to like their first week of training or their first exposure to a movement pattern. It might be like, this is so novel to you that we could literally use the least fatiguing option and you will get plenty of stimulus. And we will be able to come back in and be able to work on that motion again sooner, earlier, et cetera. So like if I have the option to like do the same motion, but focus a little bit more on the short range or make it harder there and they're learning it, that might be the appropriate place to start because we can do more of it and we can practice it more frequently and then start shifting it more and more to lengthen when now we're not doing it for skill development, but we're actually doing it for the raw stimulus that we're trying to get.
I can even see it being implemented to have strategic times where you would want to become desensitized to come back into it. So it's going to have a greater adaptation when it goes to the harder harder lever.
The way we do deloads a lot of the time is we will basically take somebody and put them on a week or two of basically doing nothing but shorter positions with shorter rest periods. Like it's a very metabolic, like local conditioning type of training, right? And what we tend to find is like, I mean, people get great pumps and they will get some body composition change, like, and they're getting an aerobic benefit and all of this stuff. They're not getting any soreness and whatnot. And so it's a deload on the joints and from the inflammation and all that stuff. And it tends to work really well when we're also maybe like trying to get them to recompensate in terms of like, all right, maybe we're bringing their carbs up or whatnot because we've like trained them to the point of depletion. Like doing that type of training tends to work really, really well when you're bringing somebody's food up too, right? Because you're turning the muscles into sponges at that point in time. And people love it too. So we'll use that type of training like before a photo shoot or leading into a prep and stuff like that. But in just like periodization, I mean, it's a great way to accomplish a whole lot of things at once where it's like, all right, if there is a benefit to some desensitization to that mechanical tension, cool, maybe we're accomplishing that, right? If there's just simply a benefit to like not being as beat up, reducing some of that inflammation. Maybe, you like mechanistically, we could look at it as like, does training like that maybe give me am I going to start super compensating and storing a little bit more glycogen? Am I going to improve the local transport of nutrients and maybe get a little bit of mitochondrial adaptations in that tissue so that then when I go back to my other training, I'm a little bit more tolerant to the volume. I have a little bit more recovery between sets, between sessions. Like that's how I'm looking at using metabolic training is like, hey, if all I'm doing is like heavy length and stuff, some of those mechanisms that are important for recovery or, like the better my muscle cells are producing energy and transporting it, the better I can perform and also the better I can recover. But if I'm just doing heavy length and stuff, I'm not challenging those systems to the same degree. But if I'm doing metabolic training, I'm actually challenging those systems. And so I look at it as there's probably a benefit for me from a recovery and a performance standpoint if those systems are not the limiter when I'm actually focusing directly on hypertrophy.
And I like the overarching message there, just in a way in that because a method is a less strong stimulus does not mean it is a less effective or less useful method. Do you know what I mean? Like, yes, focusing on the shortened position from a pure hypertrophy standpoint maybe is not the best, but if someone is dieting down and has less recovery resources, is more prone to get cumulative inflammation, and it allows them to handle more training volume, fantastic. And like in the same way that like sled work has no eccentric loading, which from a hypertrophy standpoint maybe is poor, but if it means you can do more of it, then you can train it more often. Maybe that makes it a better tool for GPP and things like that. So I think sometimes people just get too hung up on what is the strongest possible stimulus I can always use, and forget that, these things need to be phased in and out because they do have other benefits that you're not always going to get from focusing on that one optimal stimulus.
Yeah. It can also be like, say you want to challenge somebody with a little bit more volume. it can also be, we'll say, somewhat of a safer way to add to a program, because you're like, okay, if I add this in, I'm going to get a little bit more. It may not be the most more I could add, but I know that the fatigue cost is going to be minimized when I
well, if they're right at that threshold too, it's an easy way. Because if you have to think, man, if I put this in, they might not recover, right? Then they're probably close to that threshold, but you don't know. You think it might help. That would be what I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah. Then you can pop it in there and you stay just under, close, but just under that threshold. And maybe it's just cake for them. It's all good. Then you're like, okay, now we can actually take it without risking that overreaching.
Yep. I will, like, a lot of times, like, if one of the things somebody likes is they like having some sort of finisher or whatever, but like doing that with a really hard or lengthened exercise is not what they need physiologically. Using those type of an exercise is a great way of getting them a good pump, getting a good burn and making them feel hard, but not in a way that's going to be like, oh, well, cool, now we need 2 more days of recovery before we can train this tissue again.
My next question actually was going to be a little bit of a tangent from that. Sorry, but obviously we've got, we're talking about like optimal muscle recruitment, that type of thing, right? Most of what we see is that unilateral training is better in terms of absolute muscle recruitment. Yeah. So how much of your training with clients involves unilateral work for that reason? Or do you find that the increase in muscle recruitment, say on like a 1-arm lat pull down, do you find that the increased muscle recruitment in that lat means it's worth the extra time that it takes to obviously train both sides independently, for example? Or do you find that a lot of the time that most people don't have the time and the resources to be able to start splitting up a lot of movement patterns in that way?
Okay. So if we're looking at motor recruitment, doing things unilaterally can, but not always, will improve that. The juice has to be worth the squeeze. So it's going to be a combination between, well, if I'm doing just one limb, right, my brain only has to worry about getting signal to that one limb, right? So there's that advantage. But sometimes that can introduce a stability challenge or a coordination challenge that is going to offset that. It might be like, well, I'm not having to use my other limb to do the same thing, but now I might have more muscles doing other things. So the context in which we're going to get that is when the unilateral exercise is either just as stable, right? Yeah. Or more stable. Okay. So if we look at, like, okay, if I was doing a bilateral seated cable row, okay, if I do that one arm, right, it's just the same stability challenge. I'm exchanging a little bit of flexion demand for a tiny bit of rotation demand, but we'll say that's essentially the same. So you could argue, like, okay, we're getting more motor recruitment there. If I could use that free arm now to brace on something, I would not only be getting like the benefit of doing it single arm here, but now I maybe would be increasing stability. But then if we look at using a chest support, would that be like bilateral? That would be more stability than doing the single arm. So can I say that I'm going to get more motor recruitment out of a single arm unsupported row versus a supported chest supported row? In that case, it might be a wash where adding the stability gave me increased motor recruitment equal, or I don't know, maybe even more than doing it unilateral. Okay. I don't have the answer to all those questions, but understanding that if we want more motor recruitment, unilateral is an option, but only if we're not compensating by just making it more demanding from a stability standpoint, right? Okay. Going to a single leg squat isn't necessarily going to give us more motor recruitment, because all of a sudden now the coordination and the balance demand is significantly higher. But doing a single leg extension, for sure, you're going to get more motor recruitment out of your quad, right? Yep. So it's not just unilateral, therefore better. We have to look at the stability, component on top of that as well. So when I'm looking at trying to pick the best thing, I'm going to try and figure out, well, what makes sense of the options I have. So if we're thinking like a vertical pull, right? Well, doing a single arm vertical pull, I have all of my body weight. So the stability challenge going from one arm to the other is, there's not much of a difference at all. I would say with a row, it's a lot more challenging to stabilize a row unsupported than it is a pull down unsupported. But anytime we could add support to either, that would be better. The other component that you can get with unilateral work is, in some instances, it either allows for more range of motion, or actually some like a variation of the technique that I couldn't otherwise get.
Yeah.
You know, like sometimes like elbow flexion is a good example. Some guys can't stand and do like a bicep curl movement and actually move up and down. It looks like they're almost like standing, flapping their arms sideways because they got lats, they got a carrying angle and whatnot. So for them, it'd be like, okay, simply doing this one arm and either leaning to the side or using a cable or whatever it is, like it just simply makes the movement a little orthopedically or biomechanically optimal, right? In the case of say something like lats or pecs, well, if I'm only having one implement, I can go to positions I couldn't otherwise. Like if I'm doing a row, the narrowest I can go is to where my two hands would run into each other. But if I'm talking about stretching my lats, I can go further across than that. Yep. So that's just simply not an option in a bilateral motion. So when I'm looking at, am I going to choose a unilateral movement? It's not just motor recruitment, and that motor recruitment isn't a guarantee if there's a stability challenge. But if I can get extra range of motion, then maybe that offsets the stability loss. So it's constant, like you're just evaluating pros and cons. I wish I just had the like, hey man, here's the perfect exercise, right? That's the funny thing about the optimal thing is.
But then you wouldn't be sat here, you'd be sat in your mansion somewhere, then, right?
Yeah, right. No, that's not true. I would do it, and then somebody would copy it 5 minutes later and never even know that it came from me because they have a bigger follower.
Well, with the lats, I mean, as you're saying all that, what's going through my head is, I mean, and granted, I hate the movement because I call them bodybuilding burpees, but a freaking dumbbell row, right? Yeah. The problem there is you can't breathe, right? So then you can compare that as being that unilateral movement compared to say a one arm hammer row, where now I can fucking breathe and do the same thing. Where over a period of 30 years or whatever I've been doing this shit, the less and less I see people doing dumbbell rows and the more you see them doing machine type of rows. And I think it's just because you can't breathe. Because it literally is a bodybuilding burpee, right? But I can see that you can get a little more stretch, than you would with the machine. So there's the pros and cons of all that.
Yeah, a lot of people want there to be hard rules of like, all right, this thing always has this effect.
But that only if that plays into their bias.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, what they want is the rules that they think are important. They want those to be the important rules, and everything else that everybody else thinks important, that's trash, right? So, yeah. If you're like, man, I think volume's important, then you think that people that care about intensity are stupid or whatever. Right? That's we just live we live in a time where both the temptation and the reward for being more tribal, and absolutist is just so high, right? But I do think we are getting to a state in the industry where there's starting to be a pushback from people that are just so sick of, this team versus that team and whatever, and they're looking for that person that has the the middle of the road, balanced, like, hey, we don't have to choose between these things, right? And there's times and places and whatnot. It's just not the vocal minority is for sure the people that are at the extremes of one thing, right? Because if you have a good understanding of something and you're balanced, you're probably not the person that you're not going to yell out and be like moderation of everything. Like, you never see that, right? Whether it's politics or fitness, etc. Right? People tend to scream about their extreme ideas, not their moderate, well-balanced and thought out ones.
So with your programming, what do you do? How much do you vary the rep ranges that you use if we're going after pure hypertrophy? Because there's a lot of camps on, like you've got someone like Paul Cotter who kind of say favors lower rep ranges on pretty much everything, for example. But then obviously we've got the idea that some rep ranges bring with them secondary adaptations. So you've already mentioned focusing on the shortened position, maybe doing higher rep work, having like a metabolic conditioning effect and things like that. So do you generally work in phases where you use multiple rep ranges at individual times, or is it maybe phasic and where you focus on different rep ranges from block to block? Like, how do you mix that into a person's training on average?
So I would say at the core, it's more phasic, but that doesn't mean that it is limited. So, like take, for example, the approach of like where you have most of your primary sets and then you do a back off set or whatnot. So the core of that program would, have some sort of restricted rep range window, but then you would have like, your back offset or something that's an extremely different rep range. And so right now we see that like, okay, there maybe is a potential benefit of having some variation, but this is a very under research aspect. Okay. So, if you really hate doing multiple rep ranges, probably that's fine. If you love bouncing all over the place, I would look at it as like, what are the practical limits of that, of how well you can track it, how well you like the more consistent things are in a program, tracking becomes easier, and then therefore decision making becomes easier. The more varying you are, you're like, well, is it the volume? Is it the rep range? Is it like, it's like, okay, I don't know what's causing what at this point if there's too much. So we're kind of in we'll say a not super confident place physiologically of what's going on. So practicality is probably the thing that should lead your decisions. But what I tend to lean towards is using rep ranges that are most exercise appropriate. So if you think of like, if you want to think of like, okay, there's the scale of like, all right, we have like the most like power and relative strength at the lowest, and then we have the most metabolically endurance stuff at the highest, and then we have a range of hypertrophy and strength that's somewhere in there relatively, is like, that's the general scale and principle. But on an exercise basis, that window narrows or shifts, right? So you take something like that's got a really long lever, like a lateral raise, right? Not a lot of people are going to do triples on lateral raise. Okay. And at the same time, not a lot of people are going to, should probably be doing 20 rep front squats, so exercises, like Dave was talking about, like breathing on a dumbbell row. If you're doing very low reps, well, then that may not be a limiter. But if you're doing it for reps, anything that restricts respiration, all of a sudden that becomes a performance limiter. So when I look at rep ranges for an exercise, part of it's going to be what's the physiological goal, but then I'm going to look at, all right, where does this exercise exist on the continuum so that I make sure that something that isn't what I'm trying to accomplish doesn't become the limiter. Right. So if an exercise is a really long lever, being too heavy and too low rep range might make the skill and the technical demand of the exercise just too challenging. Right. And it also impacts my ability to, we'll say like, the difference between, 0 and 1 RIR, if you're doing a set of 5, is pretty massive. There could be like a 20, 30 pound rep, or a 20 or 30 pound gap, but like where you could be like, oh yeah, I could add 5, more pounds and still do the same. And I could add 10 or whatever before you'd eventually get to where you lose it. Like, so there's a bigger gap between reps and reserve. If you're working in high reps, then that's really, really small. Okay. So depending on what you're looking at and how you want to manage progression, et cetera. Like, so when you're working with strength, you need to work at relative intensity. So we need to be down there. When we're working at hypertrophy, well, sometimes like managing progressions and knowing where you are in terms of the effort, being able to have that scale be a little bit smaller is actually what we need to manage for our progression. But if you could be like, I can do 20 pounds less than I should and still be at the RIR that's in my program, well, that's not really conducive for hypertrophy. So there probably is a point of diminishing returns of going too heavy, especially on certain exercises. And then there's probably a point of diminishing returns of going too light, because I look at like when we're getting into the high rep ranges, if the goal is mechanical tension, I look at it as you have to accumulate a lot more less effective reps to get to the more effective reps. Like, so, the effective reps theory, has multiple takes. Some of them better than others. All right. But I think it's pretty safe. Maybe we can debate of like, do you need to go all the way to failure or is a couple reps shy? Like, there's plenty of debate to be had there, but there really isn't any debate that like, look, we need to work hard enough. And clearly the closer we get to working harder, the stimulus return is a little bit better. Right. So the principle is there. Where those lines are can get a little bit blurred, but in terms of, what I'm going to choose for a rep range, it's going to be a combination of where do I want that, from a physiological response? How does this exercise fit in there? Does it move the window to the left, to the right, somewhere in the middle? And then when I'm looking at across exercises, or if I want to include some sort of back offset or something like that, that's where it's like, okay, cool, maybe I can do that. But what I'm probably going to do is I am going to bias the majority of my volume into more of a constricted range and then maybe have one set or one exercise where maybe I might jump out of that, so that I'm not just all over the place and I have no idea what's working, what's not working, why am I fatigued, why, like, I need to have some way of managing the variables in a program. And if it's chaos, well, then I'm basically just, limiting myself in terms of, like, as a coach, I don't know how to evaluate this and make decisions. I'm just going to just be like, well, let's try this and see if that works. Didn't, right? Okay. I don't know. Let's try the next thing. Right. I would rather be like, okay, most of our volume is coming from these exercises in this rep range. And so if there's an issue, it's likely in that thing that makes up, 80 to 90% of the program.
Yeah. No, yeah. And, I think people forget there's just a practicality element there as well. Like, I've seen training programs where it's like sets of 4 to 6 on lat raise. Now, you already alluded to, like, long lever length exercise, low reps. You just open yourself up to cheating mechanisms a lot of the times, stuff, right? But, like, even just from a practicality standpoint, most people are going to be in a gym where maybe they have to go from 10-pound dumbbells to 15-pound dumbbells. If I can do 4 sets of 6 at 10-pound dumbbell and my next jump is 15, am I getting 4s when I go up to, do you know what I mean? And if I am, what do they look like? And I think even little variables like that, where it's just like, what is the possible weight progression that I can make here? People forget that plays into it, even if it's not the optimal hypertrophy range. Maybe I need a range that's more like 8 to 15, because I know that once I can hit 15 on all my work sets, if the next jump is quite large, I can still be in that target range and then have a progression parameter moving forward from that, right?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I loved using that method where it's like, hey, we're going to climb in reps. And then once we get to a certain point, then we're going to do that. That's a great way of solving a lot of problems. And I also think it's just a very simple way for a client to manage progression, because it's a lot easier to just like, all right, I'm going to try and do an extra one. Then should I go at 5 or 10 or 2.5 today? Like, okay, it's a lot easier to just be like, just keep that weight and keep going until you get here. And then, cool. If you make it too small of a jump, well, guess what? You get towards the top of the rep range again, and you should have made a bigger jump. If you make too big of a jump, well, you just end up at the bottom of the rep range, and it's still kind of close to where you'd want to be. So I think that's a very sensible and practical approach to, like, solving some of those problems.
It can be a tricky thing if it's not in person, though, because if you're saying, 3 sets of 12, and over a period of time, they're increasing the weight, that exercise may not look like the same exercise it started with. Yeah. Because they find mechanical ways to cheat to be able to do that. So in person, it's more controllable. Yeah. Right. Because you can keep the form either strict or loose, whatever you're programming, to keep that variable there. But the couple things that you guys just said that I think are key takeaways is don't let the limiting factor be something you're not trying to build. I think we need to say that, like, again, don't let the limiting factor be, because that's fucked up all the time. Right. Yeah. So then they get really good at building their limiting factor. Yeah. But the main thing that they want to build doesn't go anywhere. And then having a long enough runway to have progression, would be the other thing, kind of and thinking about what that runway would look like with the dumbbell example that you gave. Sometimes that might mean you're going to start with a weight that's going to be a little bit easier than what you can handle, but you'll lose for a slower tempo. You find a way to regress it to be able to have longer progression. Yeah.
Well, that gets back to, we had that guy asked you about the 5-3-1 programming yesterday, right? And he's like, and your question is, well, are you getting better every week? And he's like, well, yeah. And it's like, well, I don't see the problem here then. Do you know what I mean?
Do you get that shit? Like, it's like they'll ask you questions and are you making progress? Oh yeah, I'm killing it. And like, then why do you want to change it? Yeah. You think you're going to kill it twice as good?
Yeah. I think, and this is, I think, the negative of people misusing the optimal, right? Yeah. And like using it out of context is people have a FOMO. Like, even if they're getting progress, they're like, okay, cool, but could I be getting more? Like, I think, I think having a healthy curiosity is great. And I think, auditing what you're doing is great, but I think obsessing over things is not helpful, and constantly thinking that, like, I think people are more concerned about, like, sometimes, like, hey, I need to be doing the perfect program according to everybody else and forget that actually the program needs to be optimized to you, right? To your body, to your schedule, to like those are the things. So optimal is contextual, right? Like all of the things considered. When we're teaching or we're talking about something, we need to remove the individual so that we can talk about principles.
Yes.
People forget to put the individual back in when they start making a program for a person. Right, because you're not making a program on just principle. Somebody has to do that program, right? I'm sure if you're making a program that's throwing out to the masses, it's going to be largely based on principle. But then nobody should walk in and think that this is the optimal program for me, unless like, are you Captain Average? Because you would have to be average at every single thing, and then then maybe we could write a principal program for you.
No, you just made another huge point, because when we have conversations like this, we do have to remove the individual out of the conversation to talk about the principles, as you would on YouTube or anywhere else that you're putting content out, because you can't. That's why there's a drinking game of me saying it depends, which I only said that just now. Right. Because I'm using GPT to find other ways to say that, but not say that. I don't want alcoholics. I was saying it a lot, but maybe it does become, in some of these conversations, we do put individual examples in to be able to show, how those nuances kind of play out. Because man, I didn't think about this until right now, because the nuances are what all the trainers put out there to try to separate themselves from everybody else. So in any long form, it's all removed, but in the short form, it's all fucking nuance, just to create the controversy, views, hit, whatever it's going to be able to put out there.
Yeah, I think, and that's where I think people being introspective enough with their own training and being patient enough really plays into it, right? Because I think too much, like having a coach and stuff, people always seem to assume that like, oh, well, you're well educated, you've coached a lot of people, you're going to hit the nail on the head with me now. I'm going to hire you tomorrow, but you've only worked with me for 24 hours, right? Like you can have as many principles and stuff as you want, but it's still going to take time, whether you coach yourself or whether you hire a coach, to boil down exactly what works for you, what variables that need to be taken into account, things like that, right?
Well, you guys might not know, but once you actually reach a certain number of followers, they send you a crystal ball. To be
Right? Mine must have got lost in the post somewhere.
I think that's how people think it works, right? Is that okay? Like once you get to a certain level of experience or whatever, that like you can just know the things, right? And somebody being a course junkie or whatever, that's kind of the mentality you end up like when you're early, is you keep going to courses like thinking like this guy's going to give me the answers and I'm just going to walk out of here then with like the solutions. And then it never happens. So you go to the next course and the next course and the next course. And eventually you realize, okay, that's never going to happen. I need to start changing the way I'm looking at the information that I'm getting. And that's when you actually start becoming a good coach. But everybody that's looking for the answer will either be dissatisfied or they will be lied to, and they will be happy thinking they got the answer, and hopefully somebody guessed right. But if not, a lot of times those people will go through periods of excitement, disappointment, right? And that's where you get maybe people that are programming hopping or coach hopping or whatever it is, because they keep looking for the answer, get so excited if they find somebody that acts like they have the answer, and then usually get quite disappointed after they realize that wasn't the case.
You kind of answered the question that I wanted to ask both you guys, and that is, online coaching hasn't been around like for a long time, so longer than what most people think. If you go way back to like Skip Hill on forums 80 years ago, but and I used to be very vocal about not liking it at all. But over the past several years, I've gotten to know more and more people who do it successfully. Right. So it's easy to have a strong bias against it when you've never met anybody that does it successfully. But the profession has kind of evolved over a period of time. You said earlier that you're now working with people in person, right? So both you guys might be good examples, because you started online too, right? Or was it in person? So you started online, right? In person?
Yeah, in person and online.
So the coaches that are coming up now, I mean, you said the education seminars and all that kind of stuff, all that, to be able to build that, you know, there's always going to be probably multiple layers of coaches, but two distinct layers, ones that are really good, and then a bunch of them that just suck, right? So I call them the ones that actually care about helping the people, and the other ones that just want to be able to pay for their trend.
Yeah.
Right. So it's essentially what it is. Right. And so just excluding those, you know, the ones that are just doing it as a way to be able to pay for the sport that they love to be able to do. And the ones that want to aspire to be better, you know, what advice would you have for them?
I mean, in terms of like the in-person versus online, I think everybody should do some amount of in-person, even if your goal is to be completely online, right? I mean, before I did my first anything online, you know, I'd probably been coaching in person for 6 to 8 years.
Okay.
Right. And so it doesn't, I think if you start online, you're too naive to the reality of what a regular or general population person does, because most people that get into this have some sort of athletic background, right? It's becoming more diverse. Like more people are getting into coaching that maybe weren't like the rock star athlete or whatnot, you know, or like most of us are, like, at least me here, I was a failed athlete. You know, I tried hard, but you know, stopped growing in 7th grade. So there was a ceiling for me there. But you know, that doesn't represent a lot of people, and it also doesn't represent the older people. So I would say the volume of coaches are actually on the younger age of the spectrum, if we just go by like numbers, because, you know, a lot of people don't, you know, you don't see a lot of like 50, 60-year-old personal trainers, right? People tend to age out of this profession, right? So they're all rich and living on an island somewhere. I think the opposite of that, probably. They're all behind a building somewhere. But anyway, I think that if you don't jump online, or I mean, so if you don't train in person, you are handicapping your potential online, not just from a gym perspective, but also I think working with individuals in an intimate setting is going to help you be a little bit better when all of a sudden that intimacy is removed, right? Because with online coaching, your communication skills have to be even better, right? Because you have less time. Right. Like if you get to see somebody several times a week, you know, you don't just get to talk about their training. You get to get to know their life. You get to know their mannerisms, their moods. Like, man, that's an amazing experience to be able to work with somebody. Right. You can sometimes, you know, yeah. Well,
I did it for a decade.
Yeah, choose your clients wisely, I would say. Right. But like that really makes it so that you can evolve on the fly in terms of your communication with the client. Right. In the online space, all of a sudden you have to be very effective in a much shorter time frame. And so if you haven't developed any people skills, which, you know, you can't learn that in a book, right? To communicate, to relate to people, you just have to do it, right? I'm a pretty introverted person in my personal life, but then when it comes to the aspect of coaching, you know, I consider one of my strong suits is literally just my ability to communicate with people, to actually get the information extracted from them that I need, and then to be able to deliver what I want, you know, from them in a way that not only will they understand, you know, but also doesn't leave them, you know, crying in their pillow or throwing their shaker against the wall, or, you know, like, you know, like you see one extreme or the other. So I think that's one piece of advice that I would give. And then the other thing that I would say is that once you do make that transition, is just understand that they're completely different. You are not trying to replicate in-person coaching with online coaching. It is a different product. It is a different service. It's for different, you know, it's for different people. But if you have no idea how to do an exercise, hiring an online coach is probably not the way to go. Like, find somebody to work in person, right? If you have the skill set and you're at the point where somebody can give you a few cues, you can send a video and they can, you know, send a video back or say some things to you, and you can make those adjustments. If you honestly can do that, cool, then maybe you can work with an online coach, right? So I think a lot of the people, you know, that are resentful or kind of poo-poo on online coaching it's because they're comparing it to in-person coaching. And I wouldn't, right? You know, it's like, you know, it's you know, it's trucks and cars, right? Like, okay, they both can get you somewhere, right? But there's no car that's the best truck. There's no truck that's the best car. Like they're meant for two different things, right?
But you're 100% right, because that's what I was doing.
Yep.
When I actually began to see that they're two different things, it took a completely different meaning in my brain.
Yep. Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons that some people, the investment that they're willing to make is just smaller. So in person, just like financially isn't going to be an option, right? And for other people, it's like, okay, I want to work with this person, but I live across the world, or there's not a specialist in my area. Like there's so many reasons that you would choose one or the other, right? It would be great if, we just took the best coaches in the world and we just cloned them and planted them all over the place in perfectly equipped gyms, that people could come to and the government paid for it all, right? Just move some finances around, blow up less people and countries and blow up more muscles in the gym, something like that. There's the cancellation coming.
Yeah. There's no disagreement here.
Yeah. But so I'm like, man, both of these things are great, and I look at the same thing. Like some people are like, oh, this person sells a $20 program, screw them. They're a piece of crap. I'm like, look, there's somebody that the only investment they're going to make into improving themselves is $20. So the $20 program should exist. It just shouldn't be confused for a $200 a week, online coach that's, intimately communicating you. And it shouldn't be confused with a $200, a session in person thing with somebody that can actually, get hands on with you. Like they're different things, but I think that, man, there's a place for everything because you can help somebody at every stage they're willing to invest. That's like the only way that we can help the most people. Right. And as the person on the other side that's providing those services, you should be striving not to compete with the things you're not doing, but to provide the best version of what you are providing, but also know who it's for. Don't bring on people that aren't actually looking for the service that you're providing and just take their money. Right. You're not going to get referrals from that person. Right. They're not going to give you a fantastic testimonial. Like if you just take their money, knowing that what they want and what they need is not what you provide. Right. So that's where it's like, choose your clients, like both, like if you're working intimately with people, definitely choose the right personalities and, stuff that you want to work with. But also, man, you're going to be more successful long-term if you provide value to the people. And that means that, for some people, it's just not going to be it. Like we were talking about this at the beginning. Like if my brand is N1, if you're a coach that works with a team of 100, there's going to be things that I teach that you're just simply not going to apply. So I'm fine saying like, as much as I think we are the best at what we do, what we do is not the best for everybody. So your money and time might be spent learning from somebody else.
Yeah. Well, that's knowing who you are.
Yeah. I mean, I was in a similar kind of scenario, worked in person only for probably 7 or 8 years before making the jump to do any real form of online coaching. And I think the biggest misconception is coaches think it's easier, like you said, but it's really not, because the information you have to go off now just diminishes hugely. And there is, I think, a little bit of a misconception or a preconception when people go into online coaching, in that they underestimate the value of their own input, in that they think the coach, again, has got all the answers straight away because I filled out an assessment form. Whereas, like you said, you see someone 3 times a week, they're generally going to give you a pretty good rundown of everything that's happened that week, right? But it's all relevant if you want to actually coach a person.
Even with that, though, because I did that for a very long time, you're not working with them in person until there's an assessment that's being done, because you don't want to get sued. The club doesn't want to get sued and all this other kind of stuff. Probably more of assessment than a lot of online coaches are doing right now with their onboarding process.
Yeah, I would argue that when you're working in person, every rep is an assessment.
It is.
Right? Like the whole, like, it's an ongoing real-time assessment every single session, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I cut you off, so continue.
No, and even, even then, if you've got someone who communicates well, you've got a very lengthy assessment process that gives you as much information as you feel you can get from that person within reason. There's only so much information you can get from lifts that you watch from a video camera on a phone, or even, physique progress photos that you get taken on a phone camera. Like you see a person lift in person versus you can watch that same lift for months on a phone camera. You can spend 20 seconds walking around them, getting a dynamic view of that squat. And even though you've watched them do that same squat almost for 6 months, you can see totally different things. So again, if you haven't had enough experience in person to at least be able to see the hints that make you think, okay, maybe that's an avenue of something I need to go down and look into further, then you're going to have no chance when you're trying to look at those things in a more removed perspective. You know, so I agree with you. It is a very different service, but I think the biggest misconception is that coaches get into it thinking it's an easier job, when if anything, doing a good job remotely is almost infinitely harder than in person, in my opinion, at least.
I think it's easier because you can do it without pants on, but
okay.
that, you know.
Well, no, the truth is it's more scalable, right?
Yeah.
But the service, it's I've said this many times, but it's a fucked up industry, right? Because you're kind of handcuffed on your price, right? Because of everybody else's price. I mean, you can't compete with this, but there's still somewhat of, when you compare it to in person, there's a big difference, you know, in the price. And there's also a big difference in how much time you can actually devote to each person when that's scaled. You know, and then you got to figure out how to onboard people to be able to do what you do effectively enough to be able to serve that client. It's all doable, right? It's just, but I'm just making your point. It's more than what they think it is. You know?
I think the other, you mentioned communication skills as well. Like, you don't have their mannerisms, their body language and stuff to go off. But then even your own communication, you know, they don't have your mannerisms, your body language to go off. So when you're communicating with someone by email, WhatsApp, message, whatever you're using, your choice of language and how you put your message out has to be chosen way more carefully, because, you know, some people are going to be offended more easily. Some people are, you know, going to interpret things in different ways. Whereas in person, if they are with you, they could watch, you know, your body language, how you're talking to them. Maybe they've got a more deep rooted relationship with you, so they know more what you are like as a person. So even just in the regular day-to-day check-ins and stuff like that, how you communicate with them needs to be more carefully thought about, because you need to think, if I'm reading this message completely removed of any emotional or visual input, how are they perceiving that? And again, that's harder because I don't know them that well either. You know, so you need to be more cautious in your approach and more clear and concise and thorough. And as we know, trying to take something that sometimes is complicated and complex and trying to make that easier and concise is difficult, right? Anyone can make something sound complicated, but you need to be a good coach, or you need to really know what you're talking about to be able to boil that down enough so that you can bridge that communication gap, which you would have more opportunity to do in person.
Yeah. You learn. I think you learn that in person because you realize this person doesn't know anything about training. I mean, if a gen pop, they don't, and they really don't. Sometimes they don't even care. They're just there because their doctor said they had to, or they're going to try to get in shape for a vacation or some shit. But getting away from that, because that's just boring gen pop shit. Is there anything right now that's like on the top of your mind that you're doing deep dives in because you like the research side and all that other kind of side? So there's a lot of topics we talked about, which you probably talk about often. You know, what are some of the things that you're deep into right now that you haven't had the opportunity to talk about a lot?
Well, I mean, we did talk about the length and bias training stuff. And actually, one of the things that we're currently working on is a guide on how to implement all of the different strategies that you can do that, right? So like, it's not just exercise selection. We talked about 1 1/4. We talk about partials. Like, there's so many things. So we're going to do like a whole guide on that. But in terms of like what we can cover, like here, in terms of what like things that are really going on, one of the things that I would say we're kind of synonymous for is like having like a stimulus mindset towards training. So taking like everything from exercise selection, rep range, all of those things, but like being like, okay, we're putting like, this is the physiological stimulus that I want. This is the individual, and then building that out. And I think that's, I don't want to say like, I don't know what everybody does, but I think we have a very unique way of looking at, like, not just say, hey, here's an exercise and it does this, but saying, hey, this exercise, I could make it do a little bit more, you know, mechanical tension stimulus if I perform it with this technique, or I put a pause or a quarter here, or I work it in this rep range, or I perform it in this order, right? And so, like, I would say, when it comes to applying nuances, just like trying to find out how to get more juice from the squeeze and everything that you do. And in order to do that, you have to know what kind of juice you're going to make, right? Like that's so I would say, like, that's one of the things that we talked a little bit about the rep ranger stuff, but like we really kind of look at it as like, hey, I have a client, they have a long goal, like, and I'm going to block periodize different like stimuli in there. So there's been like block periodization was popular. Then there's some research like, oh, maybe it doesn't matter and whatnot. But like many things, I'm like, well, that block periodization doesn't represent very well the way we do block periodization, right? I think it's more so like stereotypical old, like, okay, we did a low rep range phase and then a high rep range phase, but did we actually change all of the exercise selection and stuff like that? So that's what we do. And, that leans into like, I'm kind of a 50-50 between the bro world and the evidence-based world. Like, that's actually, I kind of try and position my place as somebody that can relate to both and not kind of fall into the dogma of either. And, I think that's why what we do works and relates to so many people. So, I think finding that sweet spot as a coach, as an athlete. So as a consumer, who do you listen to? Find some from both. Don't like choose like, yeah, I'm going to listen to the research, or no, I'm going to listen to the people in the field that have been doing this, whatever. Understand that there's values to both of those, and you're probably going to come to a lot of the same conclusions. I hope that's kind of what you're trying to pull out of me there, right? But that would be those would be the messages that I would want to send, is like, that's how we're taking the nuances of exercises and then working it into the programming world, right? Is that we're able to make block periodization more blocky, right?
Yeah,
more
actually less
specific.
blocky, right? Because there's, God, I don't know if we want to geek down this rabbit hole for a long, but I mean, there's that whole thing can be defined many different ways, right? I mean, you can take old linear periodization and basically say that's blocked, right? But then when you start getting into other models where there's transitional blocks and all these other things layered in there, then I don't know how that does not work. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's if any program is structured effectively with the specificity for the individual over a long period of time, it's going to work, because there's going to be so many times it doesn't, which creates that regulation to be able to make it progress. It's
another way I describe it. Usually when I'm not trying to roll into it as organically as that is, I just be like, don't be greedy as a coach. I think too many people, once they start learning things and they're like optimization, they're like, I want to do everything all at once. So like we used to, like, Brad Schoenfeld released, I think the first paper was in like 2010 on the mechanisms of hypertrophy, and it covered all of them. And so the trend then started as like, well, I'm going to do something in my program for every one of these mechanisms. So I'm going to train heavy, I'm going to train light, I'm going to do combat, like, and with no consideration of the overlap, whether or not any of these mechanisms interfered with each other, how the fatigue component, or like none of that stuff. And I think that, like, one of to give a little bit of background, I used to do these 6-month blocks of group coaching online where we would take people through these, like, different types of programming. And we had one that was basically that method. And that was basically, we would see some people survived it and other people regressed, but nobody thrived in that, like, try and do everything all at once. And it was the most like extreme hardcore bodybuilding program in this thing. And I'm like, wait, why is this one actually not the one that's actually producing the best results? And that's actually one of the things that motivated me to dig into the programming mechanisms a little bit more. And it's like, oh yeah, now we're going to, like, all right, instead of this, let's choose like a couple of these things to focus on that we know are synergistic, and then periodize in the others and use them in more of a complementary or a potentiation based way. But I think a lot of people, in the pursuit to deliver the best or to compete, think that they just need to do more, and they get greedy either in their own training, right? Like, oh, I'm going to outwork this person by including all of the different types of, intensifiers. So I'm going to do Maya reps after this one, and rest pause after this one, and drop sets after, this one, et cetera, or whatever it is. Right. So I think that, that the message would be like, when it comes to applying this stuff, don't get greedy and try and do everything, all at once.
What would be the best way for people to, I don't like asking questions like that anymore that way. Where would people go to be able to find out what's going on currently with you? Because your site's going to be in the description. So obviously go to the site, right?
Yeah.
So that's obvious. Go there. But which social are you on the most for people to keep up to date with what you're doing?
Instagram is what we're on the most, but we're going to be slowly transitioning to doing more and more longer form content on our YouTube, because I think now that we have made a presence on Instagram, we can deliver more value when I'm not restricted to those. So if you want an introduction to what we're doing, definitely jump on an Instagram. But I would say if you want to learn a little bit more from us and you're not quite willing to, pay $1, then make sure you follow us on YouTube, because we're just going to start doing more and more. And obviously, like, platforms like this, I think is like, we do a little bit of a podcast, but I'm not that consistent with it. But like, just go on to whatever podcast platform that you listen to. And then if you want to actually get insightful stuff from me or anybody else, I think, listening to these long form discussions is actually one of the best things that you can do, right? Because I don't think anybody can do a great job of delivering what they do on these social media platforms a day. It's like I'm trying to compete with, the attention against people that, every video starts with a butt and yoga pants for like the first 7 seconds. And then, you got me talking about like different heads of the biceps.
Podcasts are easy too, because it's easy to extract and to find people's information, because it's more long form. Over the last 24 hours, I listen to like 3 different podcasts you're on, and I can say this: you actually sound pretty good in like 2.5 speed, because that's how I listen to most podcasts. Which that's a hack if anybody didn't know that, is you don't have to listen to it in like 1 point speed. Some people have slower voices. I've had taken some to 3. Right now, I don't care if the host sounds like a mouse. But if the other person, you can still make out what they're saying, you can get through it fast. But you sounded really good. And I could actually go up to like 2.5. I'm still getting it. Yeah.
I used to talk a lot faster because I felt like I was always rushed. And then actually it was through feedback with the technology, because I would get some people that said I talk too fast.
Yeah.
But then I get others people that say like, oh yeah, I just turned you up. And I'm like, well, I'm going to talk slower, because people can always speed me up. But if you ever do the other direction, if you ever try and slow a podcast down, then it's like it's all distorted.
No, it's bad. It's bad. It's really bad. You effectively did what you were aiming to do.
You start to sound like your IQ drops 30% when you use the slower speed, but going fast seems to work. So that's actually just another thing that I've like just kind of evolved over time, of like actually just learning to speak a little bit slower in this format. And part of that's just becoming more comfortable, less anxious. Here I am at Elitefts with you guys, and it could be very easy for me to just pucker my butthole and squeak my way through this as fast as possible.
Any final thoughts?
I'm just thankful, to be here, those of you guys listening to this, Swiss was just 2 days ago, so this has been just like a great weekend to be here. And I just encourage you guys that are listening to, come to those type of things, get to those type of stuff, and, absorb from not just I would say like the people that have, been around the most, whatever, but the people that are taking the effort to make a difference, not just make a buck. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll support that by saying the people that have been around a long time, yes, listen to them. But if you listen to the people that are on the way up, listen to them. Because I'm kind of like the older person. So I'm going to kind of say, don't listen to me here in a second. Like, listen more to them, because they're in it hard. You know what I'm saying? Like, you guys are in it you're in it like I was like 25 years ago, just fucking hard, so you want to listen to all, right? But don't discount the ones that are on the way up. Even beginners that are starting to be beginner coaches, listen to them a little bit, because they're finally like putting together the basics. You know, and sometimes that's a shit we can very easily just lose. We don't forget, but we might lose a little sight of.
Yeah.
Like, oh, progressive overload, that matters. You know, it's shit like that.
Yeah.
Anyhow, thank you for coming out, Tom. Thanks for helping, and we're done.
It's one of the best ways that you can support the podcast and your training is to join the crew. When you join the crew, you get an extra crew cast podcast every single month. You also get access to our Discord, which has a training Q&A with Team Elite FTS members. You get form checks. You can upload any of your training footage and have your lifts diagnosed, sometimes within minutes, by multiple people. Access to close to 30 different ebooks, training logs, and first sign up access to our weekend training retreats, train your ass off, and other events that we do. Biggest takeaways from that, though, what people enjoy the most and get the most out of is the training Q&A and the form checks, as well as the extra podcast. All right, guys, I'm back in the gym with another limited edition apparel drop. This is the new Live, Learn, Pass On shirt. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about our cambered grip American cable attachment. This attachment has 4 grips and it's cambered. So when you flip it, it actually becomes 8 grips. And if you turn it upside down, there's actually 16. This is one of our most used cable attachments out in the gym. Even got that full range of motion. We got a second limited edition drop this month as well. Head over to elitefts.com, pick up the shirt, pick up the cable attachments, and we'll see you next time.
Americ Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told as part of getting older? You just go to americhealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done. And then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. americhealth.com/table talk. The discount code is table talk.